Jack always loved the night. The darkness and silence that swallowed everything gave him a sense of power. So when he got the offer to work as a night guard at an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town, he accepted without hesitation. The pay was good, and the night hours were just what he wanted. The factory was old, yet still massive. Its cold, steel walls were weathered and dull under the faint, flickering emergency lights. Jack often told himself, just a few quiet nights, easy work, but he was wrong. The first night was uneventful. He was alone, or at least he thought so. A few hours into his shift, a faint knocking sound echoed from one of the distant hallways. The knocks were steady, heavy, almost as if something or someone was banging against the wall. Jack quickly stood up, grabbing his flashlight. The weak beam cut through the decaying walls as he made his way down the narrow, dark corridor. There was no one there. He smiled to himself and muttered, "Just the wind." But the knocking didn't stop. With each step he took forward, the sound grew louder, more defined. It was as if the walls of the factory were breathing. He reached the end of the hallway, where an old metal door stood, rusty with age. The knocking came from behind that door. Jack grabbed the handle and pulled it open. Behind the door was a small, empty room. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just silence and darkness. Jack let out a breath of relief, but as he turned to leave, he heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, behind him. Jack froze. He didn't want to believe it. Slowly, he turned his head, but no one was there. Only the sound of his own breathing filled the tiny room. "It's just my imagination," he muttered angrily to himself and rushed out of the room. But just as he stepped back into the hallway, the lights started going out one by one. Jack was paralyzed with fear. The beam of his flashlight flickered. He quickly raised it, but wherever he pointed the light, all he could see were the cold, silent walls. He took slow, cautious steps, heading back toward the security office. But halfway down the hallway, he noticed something, a tall, dark shadow standing at the far end of the corridor. Jack aimed his flashlight at the shadow, but it vanished. What was that? He whispered to himself, fear tightening his throat as he quickened his pace. The sound of the shadow's footsteps, however, kept following him. "I've got to get out of here." Jack panicked and sprinted toward the factory's main exit. The echo of his footsteps bounced off the metal floors, warning him that something was closing in on him. But when he reached the exit door, it was locked. He yanked at it with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of the footsteps grew closer. Jack turned back, flashing the light down the corridor again. No one was there, yet the sound of heavy breathing filled the space. Suddenly, a whisper, soft but chilling, came from behind him. "Jack! Jack!" He froze. He didn't dare turn around. The whisper drew nearer until it was right at his ear. "I've been waiting for you." Jack screamed, dropping the flashlight. It hit the cold metal floor with a clang, its weak beam casting a dim light over the ground. But nothing was there. Silence. The only thing Jack could hear was the pounding of his heart. He slowly crouched down, hugging his knees, sitting in a dark corner. The whispers now came from everywhere, surrounding him, but he didn't dare move. "I've been waiting for you, Jack. I've always been waiting." In the morning, when the day shift arrived, the only thing they found was a dead flashlight lying in the middle of the hallway. Jack was never found. Sam liked his new job, or at least that's what he thought at first. A night shift security guard at a large multi-story parking garage in the heart of the city seemed ideal for someone who hated the noise and chaos of the day. Plus, with all the CCTV cameras, he could monitor the entire place from the safety of his small office without ever needing to leave. Every night, Sam sat in his tiny booth, staring at the monitors. The parking garage was almost always empty, with only a few cars parked sporadically. He often told himself, just a few hours of watching these screens, then I can go home. But soon enough, he realized that the parking garage had a strange life of its own during the night. The first odd event happened about a week into the job. It was around 3 a.m, the time when most people were fast asleep. Sam was idly watching the fourth-floor camera feed, focusing on an old black car that had been parked there since his first night. Something caught his eye. A small shadow darted quickly past the car. He zoomed in, but there was nothing there. Sam shrugged it off, mumbling to himself. Probably one of those stray cats. But just as he looked away, the shadow reappeared, this time closer, right in front of the camera. It stood there unmoving. Sam's spine tingled. He zoomed in again, trying to make out a face, but there was none, just a shapeless darkness. What kind of prank is this? He muttered under his breath and decided to leave the booth to investigate. Grabbing his flashlight, he stepped out into the cold, empty garage. The wind whistled through the vast concrete structure. Sam made his way slowly to the fourth floor. His footsteps echoed on the concrete, and while the garage was silent, he felt a strange sensation, like he wasn't alone. When he reached the fourth floor, the black car was still there, but the shadow was gone. He shined his flashlight around the car, walking slowly around it. Everything seemed normal, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Suddenly, he spun around. No one was there. Just my nerves? I'm tired. Shaking his head, Sam walked back to the security booth. But as soon as he sat down and looked at the monitors again, the shadow had reappeared, this time standing right where he had been moments before. Fear crept into his chest. He quickly grabbed the phone to call the police, but the line was dead. The screens began to flicker with static, images cutting in and out. Then, as quickly as the chaos started, everything returned to normal. Sam scanned the monitors. The shadow was gone again. He took a deep breath and tried to convince himself. Must have been a technical issue, just that. But as soon as he stood up from his chair, a heavy footstep echoed from the hallway just outside the door. Slow, deliberate. Sam grabbed his flashlight again and crept toward the door. His heart pounded in his chest. He swung the door open, but the hallway was empty. He quickly turned back to the monitors, focusing on the feed from the 5th floor. There, the shadow stood again, now moving toward the camera, closer and closer, until all he could see was a solid wall of blackness. Suddenly, a whispering voice filled the room. "Sam, I see you."
I see you.
He dropped the flashlight, and the screens went black. The only thing left was a suffocating silence. Sam backed away slowly, sinking into his chair. His heart raced. He tried to reboot the monitors, but nothing happened. Finally, the screens flickered back on, showing nothing unusual. The shadow had disappeared once again. Sam exhaled in relief and leaned his head against the wall. Maybe it was all just his mind playing tricks on him. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something shift on the screen. The camera feed from the 1st floor glitched. There, standing at the entrance of the parking garage, was the shadow. But this time, it had a face. A face that looked exactly like Sam's, with a cold, lifeless smile. Mike and Paul were the night shift security guards for a large city park. By day, the park was bustling and full of life, but at night, it transformed into a quiet, eerie place. Mike would always joke, "At night, this park doesn't even seem to breathe." Neither of them knew that tonight, something in the park would change, something that would not only challenge the silence, but also their sanity. Mike was used to patrolling the park, but that night, everything felt off. The park lights seemed dimmer than usual, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long. "Paul, do you feel like something's different tonight?" Mike asked uneasily through his radio. Paul, stationed in another part of the park, replied, "Everything's normal, Mike. You're imagining things." But Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As Mike continued his usual patrol, he began to hear footsteps following him. Yet every time he turned around, there was nothing there. He nervously grabbed his radio again and said, "Paul, I think someone's following me." But before he could get a response, strange static came through the radio. Mike stopped in his tracks. The entire park had fallen into a heavy silence. The trees swayed as if they were alive, breathing with the wind. He tried to convince himself, "It's just my imagination." As he walked through the trees, a shadow flickered in the corner of his eye. Mike quickly turned, but nothing was there. "Damn it, I must be tired." But his legs felt heavier with each step, as if something unseen was pulling him back. Paul was in the control room, watching the park's security cameras. Everything seemed normal on the screens, but Mike's voice still echoed in his mind. "Someone's following me." Suddenly, one of the cameras caught something. Paul zoomed in and froze. Among the trees, there was a large shadow, humanoid but unnaturally tall, standing still. The trees weren't moving, yet this figure remained. Without hesitation, Paul grabbed the radio and yelled, "Mike, get out of there! There's something there!" But there was no reply. Paul couldn't wait any longer. He rushed out of the control room and ran toward Mike's last known location. Mike, meanwhile, was standing in the middle of the trees. Strange whispers filled his ears, whispers he couldn't trace back to any source. "Mike!" The whispers seemed to be calling his name. He looked around, but no one was there. Suddenly, everything went dark. The park lights shut off, leaving only the faint glow of the moon. Mike fumbled for his radio, his voice shaking as he said, "Paul, the lights, they're out. I can't see anything." But once again, there was no response. Paul ran as fast as he could, but the closer he got, the louder the whispers became. When Paul finally reached Mike, he found him standing still, motionless. "Mike! Mike!" Paul shouted, but Mike didn't respond. His eyes were wide, staring off into the distance, unblinking. Paul moved closer, shaking Mike by the shoulders, but something inside Mike had snapped. His eyes were lifeless, as if his mind had left this world. Paul started to feel it too, the overwhelming pressure on his mind. The whispers were no longer in the distance. They were in his head, calling his name. "Paul! Paul!" Paul couldn't take it any longer. He stepped away from Mike and began running toward the park gates. But something or someone was chasing him through the trees. Heavy footsteps and breath echoed in the dark. When Paul reached the gates, he turned around one last time, but only shadows moved between the trees. It was too late. His mind had given in too. The next morning, both guards were found in the park, driven mad by fear. Mike's eyes were still fixed on the sky, while Paul sat in the corner of the park, muttering to himself, "They're still here?" John always thought that working as a night security guard in a morgue was one of the easiest jobs in the world, just sitting in the control room and watching the monitors. But that night, everything changed. That night, the morgue was alive. It was 1 a.m. The cold of the morgue always bothered John, but tonight felt colder than ever. He wrapped his coat tighter around him and tried to shake off the chill. His gaze was fixed on the security monitors, displaying rows of cold storage units where the bodies were kept. Just lifeless bodies, just lifeless bodies. He reassured himself, but a strange sensation crawled beneath his skin, something he couldn't explain. Just as he took a sip of his hot tea, a beeping sound emitted from one of the units. John glanced at the screen dismissively and said, "Just another technical issue." He was used to these noises, old fans and cooling systems occasionally malfunctioning. But this time, the sound was different. The beeps were more rhythmic and shorter than usual. John walked towards the control panel, and the number of the malfunctioning unit flashed on the monitor. Unit 23. He frowned at it. Same damn unit? It had issues last week too. He grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the body storage area. His footsteps echoed on the cold floor. As he reached Unit 23, he noticed it was slightly ajar. Hesitantly, he stepped back. Did someone open this? No way. Taking a deep breath, he opened the drawer fully. The body inside lay still, with a pale face staring blankly at the ceiling. Everything seemed normal, or at least it should have been. But John couldn't bear the thought of that lifeless body. As he was closing the drawer, he suddenly felt something move. He stepped back and shone his flashlight on the body. For a fleeting moment, he was sure he saw the hand twitch. His heart raced. No, it's just my imagination, he tried to convince himself. As he walked back to the control room, the sound of tapping came from behind him, a quiet, rhythmic sound. He quickly turned around, staring into the storage area. Everything appeared normal, but he felt something crawling under his skin. Back in the control room, he tried to focus on his work, but he couldn't shake the sound of tapping from his mind. Each time he glanced at the monitors, he expected to see some movement, but the bodies remained still. As the clock neared 3 a.m., the security monitors began to flicker. One of the camera feeds suddenly distorted, and the beeping alarm went off again. Unit 23. John stared at the monitor in alarm. This time something was different. The camera feed from Unit 23 was fuzzy, but he could see something moving quickly within it, a shadow barely distinguishable. He took a deep breath and rushed to the door. But before he could reach the unit, the tapping grew louder, this time more forceful. "Who's there?" John shouted, his voice shaky. He moved toward the unit, but as he got closer, the drawer opened again, this time wide enough for him to see clearly inside. The body's hand shot up. Its eyes, which should have been closed, were wide open, staring directly at John. John took several steps back, trembling as he reached for his radio, but it was silent. He tried to calm himself. "Just my imagination, just my imagination." Suddenly, all the lights in the morgue went out. The darkness enveloped him. The only source of light was his flashlight, trembling in his hand. "I need to get out of here." but his legs wouldn't move. The knocking echoed again, this time coming from all the units. The bodies, one after another, began to pound against their drawers. John sprinted toward the door, but when he reached it, he found it locked. He pounded on the door desperately, but it wouldn't budge. He turned back, and all the units were open now. The bodies were emerging, one by one, their cold, lifeless forms, but their eyes wide and alive. No, this can't be real. He huddled in a corner of the room, closing his eyes. The sound of cold, slow footsteps drew nearer. The next morning, they found him sitting in a corner of the morgue, eyes wide open and staring blankly at the wall. His mind had lost its grip on this world.